Chapter 29 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When he could not get away, after the maid had let him in and he had given his name and was waiting in the formal little reception room, he was not only more frightened than he had ever been in his life, but frightened in a way he had never known anything about before. He sat far forward on the stiff little French chair, fairly afraid to let his feet press on the rug. He did not look around him. He did not believe he would be able to move when he had to move. He knew he would not be able to speak. He was appalled at the consciousness of what he had done, of where he was. He would joyfully have given anything he had in the world just to be outdoors, just not to have been there at all. There was what seemed a long wait, and the only way he got through it was by telling himself that Mrs. Williams would not see him. Of course she wouldn't see him. There was a step on the stairs. He told himself that it was the maid, coming to say Mrs. Williams could not see him. But when he knew there was someone in the doorway he looked up, and then, miraculously, he was on his feet and standing there bowing to Mrs. Williams. He thought she looked startled upon actually seeing him, as if she had not believed it was really he. There was a hesitating moment when she stood in the doorway, a moment of looking a little as if trying to overcome a feeling of being suddenly sick. Then she stepped forward and, though pale, had her usual manner of complete self-possession. "You wished to see me?" she asked, in an even tone faintly tinged with polite incredulity. "Yes," he said, and was so relieved at his voice sounding pretty much all right that he drew a longer breath. She looked hesitatingly at a chair, then sat down. He resumed his seat on the edge of the stiff little chair. She sat there waiting for him to speak. She still had that look of polite incredulity. She sat erect, her hands loosely clasped. She appeared perfectly poised, unperturbed, but when she made a movement for her handkerchief he saw that her hand was shaking. "I know I've got my nerve to come here, Mrs. Williams," he blurted out. She smiled faintly, and he saw that as she did so her lip twitched. "I'm leaving for the West this afternoon. I'm going out there to live, to work." That he had said quite easily. It was a little more effort to add, "and I wanted to see you before I went." She simply sat there waiting, but there was still that little twitching of her lip. "Mrs. Williams," he began quietly, "I don't know whether or not you know that I've been with my sister Ruth this summer." When she heard that name spoken, there was a barely perceptible drawing back, as when something is flicked before one's eyes. Then her lips set more firmly. Ted looked down and smoothed out the soft hat he was holding, which he had clutched out of shape. Then he looked up and said, voice low, "Ruth has come to mean a great deal to me, Mrs. Williams." And still she did not speak, but sat very straight, and there were 2 small red spots now in her pale cheeks. "And so," he murmured after a moment, "that's why I came to you." "I think," she said in a low, incisive but unsteady voice, "that I do not quite follow." He looked at her in a very simple, earnest way. "You don't?" he asked. There was a pause, and then he said, "I saw you at the theatre last night." "Indeed," she murmured, with a faint note of irony. But she did not deflect him from that simple earnestness. "And when I went home I thought about you." He paused and then added, gently, "Most all night I thought about you." And still she only sat there looking at him and as if holding herself very tight. She had tried to smile at that last, and the little disdainful smile had stiffened on her lips, making them look pulled out of shape and set that way. "I said to myself," Ted went on, "what's she getting out of it?" His voice came up on that. He said it rather roughly. Her face flamed. "If this is what you have come here to say," she began in a low, angry voice, "if this is what you have intruded into my house for, you—" She made a movement as if about to rise. Ted threw out his hand with a little gesture of wanting to explain. "Maybe I shouldn't have put it that way. I hope I didn't seem rude. I only meant," he said, gently, "that as I watched you, you didn't look as though you were happy." "And what if I'm not?" she cried, as if stung by that. "What if I'm not? Does that give you any right to come here and tell me so?" He shook his head, as if troubled at again putting things badly. "I really came," he said in a low, earnest voice, "because it seemed to me it must be that you did not understand. It occurred to me that perhaps no one had ever tried to make you understand. I came because it seemed fairer, to everybody." Something new leaped into her eyes. "I presume it was suggested to you?" she asked sharply. "No, Mrs. Williams, it was not suggested to me." As she continued to look at him with suspicion, he colored a little and said quietly, "You will have to believe that, because I give you my word that it is true." She met the direct look of his clear hazel eyes, and the suspicion died out of her own. But new feeling quickly flamed up. "And hasn't it occurred to you," she asked quiveringly, "that you are rather well, to be very mild indeed, rather a presumptuous young man to come to me, to come into my house with this?" There was a big rush of feeling as she choked. "Nobody's spoken to me like this in all these years." "That's just the trouble," said Ted quickly, as if they were really getting at it now. "That's just the trouble." "What do you mean?" she asked sharply. "Why, just that. Nobody has talked to you about it. Everybody has been afraid to, and so you've just been let alone with it. Things get worse, get all twisted up, get themselves into a tight twist that won't come out when we're shut up with them." His face looked older as he said, "I know that myself." He meditated upon that an instant, then, quickly coming back to her, looked up and added gently, "So it seemed to me that maybe you hadn't had a fair show just because everybody has been afraid of you and let you alone." Her two trembling hands were pulling at her handkerchief. Her eyes were very bright. "And you aren't afraid of me?" she asked with a little laugh that seemed trying to be mocking but was right on the edge of tears. He shook his head. "That is," he qualified it with a slight smile, "not much, now." Then he said, as if dropping what they were talking about and giving her a confidence, "While I was waiting for you I was so scared that I wished I could drop dead." His smile in saying it was so boyish that she too dropped the manner of what they were talking about and faintly smiled back at him. It seemed to help her gain possession of herself, and she returned to the other with a crisp, "And so, as I understand it, you thought you'd just drop in and set everything right." He flushed and looked at her a little reproachfully. Then he said, simply, "It seemed worth trying." He took a letter from his pocket. "I got this from my sister this morning. The girl who has been working for her has gone away. Her mother came and took her away. She had heard. They're always hearing. This has happened time after time." "Now just let me understand it," she began in that faintly mocking way, though her voice was shaking. "You propose that I do something to make the servant problem easier for your sister. Is that it? I am to do something, you haven't yet said what, to facilitate the domestic arrangements of the woman who is living with my husband. That's it, isn't it?" she asked with seeming concern. He reddened, but her scoffing seemed to give him courage, as if he had something not to be scoffed at and could produce it. "It can be made to sound ridiculous, can't it?" he concurred. "But—" He broke off, and his eyes went very serious. "You never knew Ruth very well, did you, Mrs. Williams?" he asked quietly. The flush spread over her face. "We were not intimate friends," was her dry answer, but in that voice not steady. He again colored, but that steady light was not driven from his eyes. "Ruth's had a terrible time, Mrs. Williams," he said in a quiet voice of strong feeling. "And if you had known her very well, knew just what it is Ruth is like, it seems to me you would have to feel sorry for her." She seemed about to speak again in that mocking way, but looking at his face, the fine seriousness, the tender concern, she kept silence. "And just what is it you propose that I do?" she asked after a moment, as if trying to appear faintly amused. Very seriously he looked up at her. "It would help, even at this late day, if you would get a divorce." She gasped. Whether she had been prepared for it or not, she was manifestly unprepared for the simple way he said it. For a moment she stared at him. Then she laughed. "You are a most amazing young man," she said quiveringly. As he did not speak, but only looked at her in that simple, direct way, She went on, with rising feeling. You come here, to me, into my house, proposing that, in order to make things easier for your sister in living with my husband, I get a divorce. He did not flinch. It might do more than make things easier for my sister, he said quietly. What do you mean? She demanded sharply. It might make things easier for you. And what do you mean by that? She asked in that quick, sharp way. It might make things easier, he said, just to feel that, even at this late day, you've done the decent thing. She stood up. Do you know, young man, that you've said things to me that are outrageous to have said? She was trembling so, it seemed hard to speak. I've let you go on just because I was stupefied by your presumption, staggered and rather amused at your childish audacity, but you've gone a little too far. How dare you talk to me like this? She demanded with passion. He had moved toward the door. He looked at her, then looked away. His control was all broken down now. I'm sorry to have it end like this, he muttered. She laughed a little, but she was shaken with the sobs she was plainly making a big effort to hold back. I'm so sorry, he said, with such real feeling that the tears brimmed from her eyes. He stood there awkwardly. Somehow her house seemed very lonely, comfortless, and now that her composure was broken down, the way she looked made him very sorry for her. I don't want you to think, he said gently, that I don't see how bad it has been for you. She tried to laugh. You don't think your sister was very fair to me, do you? She asked chokingly, looking at him in a way more appealing than aggressive. I suppose not, he said. No, I suppose not. He stood there considering that. But I guess, he went on diffidently, I don't just know myself, but it seems there come times when being fair gets sort of lost sight of. The tears were running down her face, and she was not trying to check them. He stood there another minute, and then timidly held out his hand. Goodbye, Mrs. Williams, he said gently. She took his hand with a queer, choking little laugh, and held it very tight for a minute, as if to steady herself. His own eyes had dimmed. Then he smiled, a smile that seemed to want to go ahead and take any offense or hurt from what he was about to say. Maybe, Mrs. Williams, that you will come to feel like being fairer to Ruth than Ruth was to you. His smile widened, and he looked very boyish as he finished. And that would be one way of getting back, you know. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Freeport had a revival of interest in Mrs. Stuart Williams that fall. They talked so much of her in the first years that discussion had pretty well spent itself, and latterly it had only been rarely, to a stranger or when something came up to bring it to them freshly, that they did more than occasionally repeat the expressions which that first feeling had created. There was no new thing to say of their feeling about her. No one had become intimate with her in those years, and that itself somehow kept the picture. She was unique, and fascinated them in the way she was one of them and yet apart. The mystery enveloping her made it mean more than it could have meant through disclosures from her. It kept it more poignant to speculate about a concealed suffering than it could have continued to be through discussing confidences. But even speculation as to what was beneath that unperturbed surface had rather talked itself out, had certainly lost its keen edge of interest with the passing of the years. That fall, however, they began to speak of a change in her. They said first that she did not look well, then they began to talk about her manner being different. She had always kept so calm, and now there were times when she appeared nervous. She had had throughout a certain cold serenity. Now she was sometimes irritable, disclosing a fretfulness close under the untroubled surface. She looked older, they said. Her brows knit, and there were lines about mouth and eyes. She seemed less sure of herself. It made interest in her a fresh thing. They wondered if she were not at last breaking, spoke with a careful show of regret, concern, but whetted anticipations gave eagerness to voices of sympathy. They wondered if Ruth Holland's having come home in the spring, the feeling of her being in the town, could have been too much of a strain, preying upon the deserted wife and causing her later to break. There were greedy wonderings as to whether she could possibly have seen Ruth Holland, whether anything had happened that they did not know about. Late one December afternoon, Mrs. Williams came home from a church bazaar, and curtly telephoned that she would not be back for the evening. She spoke of a headache. And her head did ache. It ached, she bitterly reflected, from being looked at, from knowing they were taking observations for subsequent speculation. She had been in charge of a table at the bazaar. A number of little things had gone wrong, and she got out of patience with one of her assistants. Other people got irritated upon occasions of that sort, and that was all there was to it. But she was not at liberty to show annoyance. She knew at the time that they were whispering around about it, connecting it with the thing about her that it seemed never really went out of their minds. The sense of that had made her really angry, and she had said sharp things she knew she would be sorry for, because they would just be turned over as part of the thing that was everlastingly being turned over. She was not free. They were always watching her, even after all these years, always thinking that everything had something to do with that. Mrs. Hughes, her housekeeper and cook, had followed her upstairs. At the door of her room she turned impatiently. She had known by the way the woman hung around downstairs that she wanted to say something to her, and she had petulantly not given her the chance. She did not want anything said to her. She wanted to be let alone. "Well?" she inquired ungraciously. Mrs. Hughes was a small, trim woman, who had a look of modestly trying not to be obtrusive about her many virtues. She had now that manner of one who could be depended upon to assume responsibilities a less worthy person would pass by. "I thought perhaps you should know, Mrs. Williams," she said with faintly rebuking patience, "that Lily has gone to bed." "Oh, she's really sick then, is she?" asked Mrs. Williams, unbending a little. "She says so," replied Mrs. Hughes. The tone caused her to look at the woman in surprise. "Well, I presume she is then," she answered sharply. Lily was the second girl. 2 servants were not needed for the actual work, as the household consisted only of Mrs. Williams and an aged aunt who had lived with her since she had been alone, but the house itself did not seem adapted to a one-servant menage. There had been 2 before, and in that, as in other things, she had gone right on in the same way. Mrs. Hughes had been with her for several years, but Lily had been there only 3 or 4 months. She had been a strange addition to the household. She laughed a good deal, and tripped about at her work and sang. But she had not sung so much of late, and in the last few days had plainly not been well. "If she's really sick we'll have to have a doctor for her," Mrs. Williams said, her hand on the knob she was about to turn. "She says she doesn't want a doctor," answered Mrs. Hughes, and again her tone made Mrs. Williams look at her in impatient inquiry. "Well, I'll go up after a while and see her myself," she said, opening the door of her room. "Meanwhile, you look after her, please. And oh, Mrs. Hughes," she called back, "I shan't want any dinner. I had a heavy tea at the bazaar," she added hurriedly, and as if resentful of having to make any explanation. Alone, she took off her hat, pushed back her hair as if it oppressed her, then sank into a low, luxurious chair, and, eyes closed, pressed her fingers over her temples as if to command quiet within. But after a moment she impatiently got up, and went over to her dressing-table and sat looking into the mirror. The thing that had started her afternoon wrong was that a friend of her girlhood, whom she had not seen for about 13 years, had appeared unexpectedly at her table, startling her and then laughing at her confusion. She had not known that Stella Cutting was in town. To be confronted that way with someone out of the past had been unnerving, and then she had been furious with herself for not being able more easily to regain composure. People around her had seen. Later she saw them looking at her strangely, covertly interested when she spoke in that sharp way to Mildred Woodbury because she had tossed things about. She had been disturbed, for one thing, at finding Mildred Woodbury at her table. She was looking in the glass now, because Stella Cutting had been one of her bridesmaids. She was not able to put down a miserable desire to try to see just what changes Stella had found. The dissatisfaction in her face deepened with her scrutiny of it. Doubtless Stella was that very minute talking of how pitifully Marian Averley had changed, how her color used to be clear and even, features firmly molded, eyes bright. She herself remembered how she had looked the night Stella Cutting was her bridesmaid. And now her color was muddy, and there were crow's feet about her eyes and deep lines from her nostrils to the corners of her mouth. Stella Cutting looked older herself, very considerably older, but it was a different way of looking older. She had grown stout, and her face was too full, but she did not look pulled at like this. As she talked of her children, hers was the face of a woman normally, contentedly growing older. The woman sitting before the mirror bitterly turned away now from that reflection of dissatisfaction with emptiness. It was that boy had done it, she thought with a new rise of resentment. She had been able to go along very evenly until he impertinently came into her house and rudely and stupidly broke through the things she had carefully builded up around herself. Ever since he had plunged into things even she herself had been careful not to break into, there had been this inner turmoil that was giving her the look of an old woman. If Stella Cutting had come just a few months earlier, she could not have had so much to say about how terribly Marian Averley had changed. Why was she so absurd as to let herself be upset? She angrily asked of herself, beginning to unfasten the dress she was wearing, that she might get into something loose and try to relax. A hook caught in some lace, and in her vexation at not being able at once to unfasten it, she gave it a jerk that tore the lace. She bit her lips and could have cried. Those were the things she did these days, since that boy came and blunderingly broke into guarded places. She sat in a low, deep chair before the open fire that burned in the sitting-room adjoining her bedroom. It was the room that had been her husband's. After he went away, she took it for an upstairs sitting-room, a part of her program of unconcern. As she sank down into the gracious chair, she told herself that she would rest for that evening, not think about things. But not to think about things was impossible that night. Stella Cutting had brought old things near and made them newly real. Her girlhood, her falling in love with Stuart Williams, her wedding. Those reminiscences caught her and swept her on to other things. She thought of her marriage, thought of things that, ever since that boy came and made her know how insecure she really was in the defenses she had put up for herself, it had been a struggle to keep away from. She had not done much thinking, probing, as to why it was her marriage had failed. That was another one of the things her pride shut her out from. When it failed, she turned from it, clothed in pride, never naked before the truth. There was something relaxing in just letting down the barriers which had recently been so shaken that she was fretted with trying to hold them up. She wondered why Stella Cutting's marriage had succeeded and hers had failed. The old answer that her marriage had failed because her husband was unfaithful to her, answer that used always to leave her newly fortified, did not satisfy tonight. She pushed on through that. There was a curious emotional satisfaction in thus disobeying herself by rushing into the denied places of self-examination. She was stirred by what she was doing. Her long holding back from this very thing was part of that same instinct for restraint, which she had been pleased to think of as fastidiousness, that had always held her back in love. It was alien to her to let herself go. She had an instinct that held her away from certain things, from the things themselves and from free thinking about them. What she was doing now charged her with excitement. She was wondering about herself and the man who was still legally her husband. She was thinking of how different they were in the things of love, how he gave and wanted giving, while her instinct had always been to hold herself a little apart. There was something that displeased her in abandonment to feeling. She did not like herself when she fully gave. There had been something in her, some holding back, that passionate love outraged. Intense demonstration was indelicate to her. She was that way. She had not been able to help it. She loved in what she thought of as her own fastidious way. Passion violated something in her. Falling in love had made her happy, but with her love had never been able to sweep down the reserves, and so things which love should have made beautiful had remained for her ugly facts of life that she had an instinct to hold herself away from. What she felt she did not like herself for feeling, and so their marriage had been less union than maneuvering. She supposed she had, to be very blunt, starved Stuart's love, for he wanted much love, a full and intense love-life. He was passionate and demonstrative. He gave and wanted, perhaps needed, much giving. He did not understand that constant holding back. For him the beauty of love was in the expression of it. She supposed, in this curious self-indulgence of facing things tonight, that it had been he who was normal. She had memories of many times when she had puzzled and disappointed and hurt him. And so when Gertrude Fremont, an old school friend of hers, a warm-natured Southern girl, came to visit her, Stuart turned away from things grudging and often chill to Gertrude's playfulness and sunniness and warmth. There was a curious shock to her tonight when she found herself actually thinking that perhaps it was not much to be wondered at. He was like that. She had not made him over to be like her. At first he had found Gertrude enlivening, and from a flirtation it went to one of those passages of passion between a man and a woman, a thing that flames up and then dies away. In a measure, a matter of circumstance. That was the way he tried to explain it to her when, just as Gertrude was leaving, she came to know. Even in this present abandonment to thinking, she went hurriedly past the shock of all that terrible, sordid night of finding out. Stuart had weakly and appealingly said that he hadn't been able to help it, that he was sorry, that it was all over. But with it their marriage was all over. She told him so then, told him quite calmly, it would seem serenely, went on telling him so through those first days of his unhappiness and persistence. She was always quite unperturbed in telling him so. Politely, almost pleasantly, she would tell him that she would never be his wife again. She never was. She had known very certainly from the first that she never would be. Tonight she probed into that, too. Why she had been so sure, why she had never wavered. It was a more inner thing than just jealousy, resentment, hurt, revenge, though all those things were there, too. But those were things that might have broken down, and this was not a thing that would break down. It was more particularly temperamental than any of those things. It was that thing in her which had always held her back from giving. She had given, and then her giving had been outraged. Even now she burned in the thought of that. He had called out a thing in her that she had all along, just because she was as she was, resented having had called out. And then he had flouted it. Even after all those years there was tonight that old prickling of her scalp in thinking of it. The things she might have said, of its being her own friend, in her own house, she did not much dwell upon, even to herself. It was a more inner injury than that. Something in her that was curiously against her had been called to life by him, and then he had outraged what she had all along resented his finding in her. To give at all had been so tremendous a thing, then to have it lightly held. It outraged something that was simply outside the sphere of things forgivable. And that outraged thing had its own satisfaction. What he had called to life in her, and then, as it seemed, left there unwanted, what he had made in her that was not herself, then left her with, became something else, something that made her life. From the first until now, or at any rate until 2 months ago when that boy came and forced her to look at herself, the thing in her that had been outraged became something that took the place of love, that was as the other pole of love, something that yielded a satisfaction of its own, a satisfaction intense as the things of love are intense, but cold, ordered, certain. It was the power to hurt, the power to bring pain by simply doing nothing. It was not tempestuously done. It had none of the uncertainty of passionate feeling. It had the satisfaction of power without effort, of disturbing and remaining undisturbed, of hurting and giving no sign. It was the revenge of what was deeply herself for her calling her out from herself, for not wanting what was found in her that was not herself. Stuart wanted her again, terribly wanted her, more than ever wanted her. He loved, and so could be hurt. He needed love, and so could be given pain. He thought she would give in. She knew that she would not. There was power in that knowledge, and so she watched him suffer and herself gained new poise. She did not consider how it was a sorry thing to fill her life with. When, that night that was being like struck by lightning, she came to know that the man to whom she had given, she, had turned from her to another woman, it was as if she was then and there sealed in. She would never let herself leave again. Outraged pride blocked every path out from self. She was shut in with her power to inflict pain. That was all she had. And then that boy came and made her look at herself and know that she was poor. That was why Stella Cutting could be talking of how Marian Averley had broken. They were talking about it, of course, about her and Ruth Holland and her husband. Her husband, she thought insistently, but without getting the accustomed satisfaction from the thought. Miserably she wondered just what they were saying. She flinched in the thought of their talk about her hurt, her loneliness. And then she felt a little as if she could cry. She had wondered if she had anybody's real pity. That thought of their talking of it opened it to her, drew her to it. She thought of Ruth Holland, gave up the worn pretense of disinterest, and let herself go in thinking of her. The first feeling she had had when she suspected that her husband was drawn to that girl, Ruth Holland, was one of chagrin, a further hurt to pride. For her power to give pain would be cut off. Once she saw the girl's face light as Stuart went up to her for a dance. She knew then that the man who had that girl's love could not be hurt in the way she had been hurting. At first she was not so much jealous as strangely desolated. And then as time went on, and in those little ways that can make things known to those made acute through unhappiness, she came to know that her husband cared for this girl and had her love. Anger at having been again stripped, again left their outrage, made her seize upon the only power left, that more sordid, more commonplace kind of power. She could no longer hurt by withholding herself. She could only hurt by standing in the way. Rage at the humiliation of being reduced to that fastened her to it with a hold not to be let go. All else was taken from her, and she was left with just that. Somehow she reduced herself to it. She became the quality of it. Pride, or rather self-valuation, incapacity for self-depreciation, had never let her be honest with herself. As there were barriers shutting the world out from her hurt and humiliation, so too were there barriers shutting herself out. She did not acknowledge pain, loneliness, for that meant admission that she could not have what she would have. She thought of it as withdrawal, dignified withdrawal from one not fit. She had always tried to feel that her only humiliation was in having given to one not worth her, one lesser. But in this reckless and curiously exciting mood of honesty tonight, she got some idea of how great the real hurt had been. She knew now that when she came to know, to feel in a way that was knowing, that her husband loved Ruth Holland, she suffered something much more than hurt to pride. It was pride that would not let her look at herself and see how she was hurt. And pride would not let her say one word, make one effort. It was simply not in her to bring herself to try to have love given her. And so she was left with the sordid satisfaction of the hurt she dealt in just being. That became the reason for her existence, the ugly reason for her barren existence. She lived alone with it for so long that she came to be of it. Her spirit seemed empty of all else. It had kept her from everything. It had kept her from herself. But now tonight she could strangely get to herself, and now she knew that far from Ruth Holland not mattering, her whole being had from the first been steeped in hatred of her. Her jealousy had been of a freezing quality. It had even frozen her power to know about herself. When, after one little thing and then another had let her know there was love between her husband and this girl, to go to places where Ruth Holland was would make her numb. That was the way it was with her. Once, in going somewhere, a part of that hideous doing things together which she kept up because it was one way of showing she was there, would continue to be there. She and Stuart drove past the Hollands, and this girl was out in the yard, romping with her dog, tussling with him like a little girl. She looked up, flushed, tumbled, panting, saw them, tried to straighten her hair, laughed in confusion, and retreated. Stuart had raised his hat to her, trying to look nothing more than discreetly amused. But a little later after she, his wife, had been looking from the other window as if not at all concerned, she turned her head and saw his face in the mirror on the opposite side of the carriage. He had forgotten her. She was taking him unawares. Up to that time she had not been sure, at least not sure of its meaning much. But when she saw that tender little smile playing about his mouth, she knew it was true that her power to hurt him had reduced itself to being in his way. That she should be reduced to that made her feeling about it as ugly as the thing itself. She did not sleep that night, after seeing Ruth Holland romping with her dog. She had cried, and was furious that she should cry, that it could make her cry, and furious at herself because of the feeling she had, a strange stir of passion, a wave of that feeling which had seemed to her unlovely even when it was desired, and that it was unbearably humiliating to feel unwanted. It was in this girl he wanted those things now, that girl who could let herself go, whom life rioted in, who doubtless could abandon herself to love as she could in romping with her dog. It tortured her to think of the girl's flushed, glowing face, panting there, hair tumbled. She cringed in the thought of how perhaps what she had given was measured by what this girl could give. As time went on, she knew that her husband was more happy than he had ever been before, and increasingly unhappy. Her torture in the thought of his happiness made her wrest the last drop of satisfaction she could from the knowledge that she could continue the unhappiness. Sometimes he would come home and she would know he had been with this girl, know it as if he had shouted it at her. It fairly breathed from him. To feel that happiness near would have maddened her, had she not been able to feel that her very being there dealt unhappiness. It was a wretched thing to live with. Beauty had not come into her life. It would not come where that was. And then she came to know that they were being cornered. She, knowing, saw misery as well as love in the girl's eyes, a hunted look. Her husband grew terribly nervous, irritable, like one trapped. It was hurting his business. It was breaking down his health. Not until afterward did she know that there was also a disease breaking down his health. She did not know what difference it might have made had she known that. By that time she had sunk pretty deep into lust for hurting, into hating. She saw that this love was going to wreck his life. His happiness was going to break him. If the world came to know, it would be known that her husband did not want her, that he wanted someone else. She smarted under that, and so fortified herself the stronger in an appearance of unconcern. She could better bear exposure of his uncaringness for her than let him suspect that he could hurt her. And they would be hurt. If it became known, it would wreck life for them both. The town would know then about Ruth Holland, that wanton who looked so spiritual. They would know then what the girl they had made so much of really was. She would not any longer have to listen to that talk of Ruth Holland as so sweet, so fine. And so she waited, sure that it would come without her having given any sign, without her having been moved from her refuge of unconcern, she who had given and not been wanted. That week before Edith Lawrence's wedding she knew that it was coming, that something was happening. Stuart looked like a creature driven into a corner. And he looked sick. He seemed to have lost hold on himself. Once, as she was passing the door of his room, it blew a little open, and she saw him sitting on the bed, face buried in his hands. After she passed the door, she halted, but went on. She heard him moving around in the night. Once she heard him groan. Instinctively she had sat up in bed, but had lain down again, remembering that he was groaning because he did not want her, because she was in the way of the woman he wanted. She saw in those days, that week before Edith Lawrence's wedding, that he was trying to say something to her and could not, that he was wretched in his fruitless attempts to say it. He would come where she was, sit there white, miserable, dogged, then go away after having said only some trivial thing. Once, she was always quite cool, unperturbed through those attempts of his, he had passionately cried out, "You're pretty superior, aren't you, Marian? Pretty damned serene." It was a cry of desperation, a cry from unbearable pain, but she gave no sign. Like steel round her heart was the feeling that he was paying now. After that outburst he did not try to talk to her. That was the last night he was at home. He came home at noon next day and said he was going away on a business trip. She heard him packing in his room. She knew, felt sure, that it was something more than a business trip. She felt sure that he was leaving. And then she wanted to go to him and say something, whether reproaches or entreaty she did not know. Listened to him moving around in there, wanted to go and say something and could not, could only sit there listening, hearing every smallest sound. She heard him speak a surly word to a servant in the hall. He never spoke that way to the servants. When he shut the front door, she knew that he would not open it again. She got to the window and saw him before he passed from sight, carrying his bag, head bent, stooped. He was broken, and he was going away. She knew it. Even tonight she could not let herself think much about that afternoon, the portentous emptiness, the strangeness of the house. Going into his room to see what he had taken, in there being tied up as with panic, sinking down on his bed and unable to move for a long time. She had forced herself to go to Edith Lawrence's wedding, and she knew by Ruth Holland's face that it was true something was happening, knew it by the girl's face as she walked down the aisle after attending her friend at the altar, knew it by her much laughter, by what was not in the laughter. Once during the evening she saw Edith put her arm around Ruth Holland, and at the girl's face then she knew with certainty, did not need the letter that came from Stuart next day. She had the picture of Ruth Holland now as she was that last night, in that filmy dress of pale yellow that made her look so delicate. She was helped through that evening by the thought that if she was going to be publicly humiliated, Ruth Holland would be publicly disgraced. She would have heard the last about that fine, delicate quality, about sweetness and luminousness. They would know, finally, that she was not those things she looked. And after it happened, the fact that they did know it helped her to go on. She went right on, almost as if nothing had happened. She would not let herself go away, because then they would say she went away because she could not bear it, because she did not want them to see. She must stay and show them that there was nothing to see. Forcing herself to do that so occupied her as to help her with things within. She could not let herself feel, for feeling would show on the surface. Even before herself, she had kept up that manner of unconcern, and had come to be influenced by her own front. And so the years went by, and her life had been made by that going on in apparent unconcern, and by that inner feeling that she was hurting them by just being in life. It was not a lovely reason for being in life. She had not known what a poor thing it was until that boy came and forced her to look at herself and consider how little she had. She rose and stood looking into the mirror above the fireplace. It seemed to her that she could tell by her face that the desire to do harm had been her reason for living. Several hours had gone by, while she sat there given over to old things. She wished she had a book, something absorbing, something to take her away from that other thinking that was lying in wait for her, those thoughts about what there was for her to live with in the years still to be lived. The magazine she had picked up could not get any hold on her. That was why, though she had made it clear she did not want to be disturbed, there was relief in her voice as she answered the tap at the door. She frowned a little, though, at sight of Mrs. Hughes standing there deferential but visibly excited. She had that look of trying not to intrude her worthiness as she said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Williams, for disturbing you, but there is something I thought you ought to know." In answer to the not very cordial look of inquiry, she went on, "It's about Lily. She says she won't have a doctor, but she needs one." There was something in her manner, something excited and yet grim, that Mrs. Williams did not understand. But then she did not much trouble herself to understand Mrs. Hughes. She was always appearing to see some hidden significance in things. "I'll go up and see her," she said. After the visit she came down to telephone for her doctor. She saw that the girl was really ill, and she had concluded from her strange manner that she was feverish. Lily protested that she wanted to be let alone, that she would be all right in a day or two, but she looked too ill for those protestations to be respected. She telephoned for her own doctor only to learn that he was out of town. Upon calling another physician's house, she was told that he had the grippe and could not go out. She then sat for some minutes in front of the phone before she looked up a number in the book and called Dr. Dean Franklin. When she rose after doing that, she felt as if her knees were likely to give way. The thought of his coming into her house, coming just when she had been living through old things, was unnerving. But she was really worried about the girl, and knew no one else to call whom she could trust. When he came, she was grateful to him for his professional manner, which seemed to take no account of personal things, to have no personal memory. "I'd like to see you when you come down, doctor," she said, as Mrs. Hughes was taking him to the maid's room on the 3rd floor. She was waiting for him at the door of her upstairs sitting room. He stepped in and then stood hesitatingly there. He, too, had a queer, grim look, she thought. "And what is the trouble?" she asked. He gave her a strange sideways glance and snapped shut a pocket of the bag he carried. Then he said, brusquely, "It's a miscarriage." She felt the blood surging into her face. She had stepped a little back from him. "Why, I don't see how that's possible," she faltered. He smiled a little, and she had a feeling that he took a satisfaction in saying to her, grimly, "Oh, it's possible, all right." She colored anew. She resented his manner, and that made her collect herself and ask with dignity what was the best thing to do. "I presume we'd better take her to the hospital," he said in that short way. "She's been horribly treated. She's going to need attention, and doubtless it would be disagreeable to have her here." That, too, she suspected him of finding a satisfaction in saying. She made a curt inquiry as to whether the girl would be all right there for the night. He said yes, and left, saying he would be back in the morning. She escaped Mrs. Hughes, whom now she understood. She did not go up again to see Lily. She could not do that then. She was angry with herself for being unnerved. She told herself that at any other time she would have been able to deal sensibly with such a situation. But coming just when things were all opened up like that, old feeling fresh, and coming from Dean Franklin, she would be quite impersonal, rational in the morning. But for a long time she could not go to sleep. Something had intruded into her guarded places, and the things of life from which she had withdrawn were here, in her house. It affected her physically, almost made her sick. The proximity of the things she had shut out of her life. It was invasion. And she thought about Lily. She tried not to, but could not help wondering about her. She wondered how this had happened, what the girl was feeling. Was there someone she loved? She lay there thinking of how, just recently, this girl who lived in her house had been going through those things. It made her know that the things of life were all the time around one. There was something singularly disturbing in the thought. Next morning she went up to see Lily. She told herself it was only common decency to do that, her responsibility to a person in her house. As she opened the door, Lily turned her head and looked at her. When she saw who it was, her eyes went sullen, defiant. But pain was in them too, and with all the rest something wistful. As she looked at the girl lying there, in trouble, in pain, she could see Lily, just a little while before, laughing and singing at her work. Something she had not felt in years, that she had felt but little in her whole life, stirred in her heart. "Well, Lily," she said, uncertainly but not unkindly. The girl's eyes were down, her face turned a little away, but she could see that her chin was quivering. "I'm sorry you are ill," Mrs. Williams murmured, and then gave a little start at the sound of her own voice. The girl turned her head and stole a look. A moment later there were tears on her lashes. "We'll have to get you well," said Mrs. Williams, in a practical, cheerful voice, and then she abruptly left the room. Her heart was beating too fast. Mrs. Hughes lay in wait for her as she came downstairs. "May I speak to you, Mrs. Williams?" she asked, in a manner at once deferential and firm. "She's to be taken away, isn't she?" she inquired in a hard voice. For a moment Mrs. Williams did not speak. She looked at the woman before her, all tightened up with outraged virtue. And then she heard herself saying, "No, I think it will be better for Lily to remain at home." After she had heard herself say it, she had that feeling that her knees were about to give way. For an instant Mrs. Hughes' lips shut tight. Then, "Do you know what's the matter with her?" she demanded in that sharp, hard voice. "Yes," replied Mrs. Williams, "I know." "And you're going to keep such a person in your house?" "Yes." "Then you can't expect me to stay in your house," flashed the woman who was outraged. "As you like, Mrs. Hughes," was the answer. Mrs. Hughes moved a little away, plainly discomfited. "I should be sorry to have you go," Mrs. Williams continued courteously. "But of course that is for you to decide." "I'm a respectable woman," she muttered. "You can't expect me to wait on a person like that." "You needn't wait on her, then," was the reply. "Until the nurse comes, I will wait on her myself." And again she turned abruptly away. Once more her heart was beating too fast. When the doctor came and began about the arrangement he had been able to make at the hospital, she quietly told him that, if it would be as well, she would rather keep Lily at home. His startled look made her flush. His manner with her was less brusque as he said good-bye. She smiled a little over that last puzzled glance he stole at her. Then she went back to Lily's room. She straightened her bed for her, telling her that in a little while the nurse would be there to make her really comfortable. She bathed the girl's hot face and hands. She got her a cold drink. As she put her hand behind her head to raise her a little for that, the girl murmured brokenly, "You're so kind." She went out and sat in an adjoining room, to be within call. And as she sat there a feeling of strange peace stole through her. It was as if she had been set free, as if something that had chained her for years had fallen away. When in her talk with Mrs. Hughes she became that other woman, the woman on the other side, on Compassion's side, something just fell from her. When that poor girl murmured, "You're so kind," she suddenly knew that she must have something more from life than that satisfaction of harming those who had hurt her. When she washed the girl's face, she knew what she could not unknow. She had served. She could not find the old satisfaction in working harm. The soft, warm thing that filled her heart with that cry, "You're so kind," had killed forever the old cruel satisfaction in being in the way. She felt very quiet in this wonderful new liberation. She began shaping life as something more than a standing in the way of others. It made life seem a different thing, just to think of it as something other than that. And suddenly she knew that she did not hate Ruth Holland any more, that she did not even hate the man who had been her husband. Hating had worn itself out. It fell from her, a thing outlived. It was wonderful to have it gone. For a long time she sat there very quiet in the wonder of that peace of knowing that she was free. Freed of the long hideous servitude of hating, freed of wanting to harm. It made life new and sweet. She wanted something from life. She must have more of that gentle sweetness that warmed her heart when Lily murmured, "You're so kind." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Holland stood at the window looking out at Colorado in January. The wide valley was buried under snow. It was late afternoon, and the sun was passing behind the western mountains. From the window where she stood she could not see the western mountains, but the sunset colors had been thrown over to the eastern range, some 50 miles away. When she first came there, 5 years before, it had seemed strange to find the east lighted at sunset, more luminous than the west. The eastern range was a mighty one. Now there was snow down to its feet, and there was no warmth in the colors that lighted it. They only seemed to reveal that the mountains were frozen. It would not have seemed possible for red, those mountains had been named Song de Cristo because they went red at sunset, to be so dazzling cold. The lighted snow brought out the contour of the mountains. They were wonderfully beautiful so, but the woman looking out at them was not thinking of them as beautiful. She was thinking of them as monuments of coldness. To her it was as if they had locked that valley into merciless cold. But it was not the sunset colors that really marked coming night for her. All through that winter something else had marked night, something she tried to keep from looking out at, but which she was not able to hold away from. She was looking at it now, looking off into the adjoining field where the sheep were huddling for the night. They had begun their huddling some time before. With the first dimming of the light, the first wave of new cold that meant coming night, a few of them would get together. Others would gather around them, then more and more. Now there was the struggle not to be left on the outside. The outer ones were pushing toward the center. They knew by other nights that this night would be frigid, that they could only keep alive by that warmth they could get from one another. Yet there were always some that must make the outer rim of the big circle, must be left there to the unbroken cold. She watched them. It had become a terrible thing for her to see, but she could not keep from looking. Many of those unprotected sheep had died that bitter winter. Others would die before spring came. It was a cruel country, a country of cold. That was their flock of sheep. They had been driven there the summer before from the lambing grounds in the mountains. The day they got there, the lambs were exhausted from the long journey. One of them had dropped before the house and died right there beside the field it had come the long way to gain. Her efforts to revive it were useless. The little thing was worn out. They were all of them close to worn out. And now they had the winter to fight. Night after night she watched them huddling there, the big, pitiful mass of them out in the bitter cold. It was the way of the country to leave them so, the only way, the sheepmen said, that sheep could be made to pay. They estimated that the loss by freezing was small, compared with what would be the cost of shelter for droves that ran into thousands, into tens of thousands. Ruth would wake at night and think of them huddled out there, would lie thinking of them as she drew the covers around herself, think of them when the wind drove against the house, and often, as tonight, when it was every instant growing colder, she wondered if what was before them filled them with terror. Sometimes she could not keep away and went nearer and looked at them. They were unbearably pitiful to her, their necks wrapped around each other's necks, trying to get from one another the only warmth there was for them. So helpless, so patient. They, play-loving creatures, gentle things, bearing these lives that men might finally use them for clothing and for food. There were times when the pathos of them was a thing she could not bear. They seemed to represent the whole cruelty of life, made real to her the terrible suffering of the world that winter of the war. She watched the sheep until the quick dusk had fallen, and then stood thinking of them huddled over there in the frigid darkness. When she found that her face was wet and realized that she had sobbed aloud, she turned from the window to the stove, drew a chair up close to it, and put her feet on the fender. It was so bitterly cold that the room was warm only near the stove. Over there by the window she had grown chilled. And as the heat enveloped her ankles, she thought of the legs of those poor frightened things that had been the last comers and not able to get to the inside of the circle, that living outer rim which was left all exposed to the frigid January night in that high mountain valley. She could feel the cold cutting against their legs, could see their trembling and their vain, frantic efforts to get within the solidly packed mass. She was crying, and she said to herself, her fingers clenched down into her palm, "Stop that! Stop that!" She did not know what might not happen to her if she were unable to stop such thinking as that. To try and force herself away from it, she got up and lighted a lamp. She looked about on her desk for a magazine she had put there. She would make herself read something while waiting for Stuart. He had had to drive into town. He would be almost frozen when he got back from that 2-mile drive. She paused in her search for the magazine and went into the kitchen to make sure that the fire there was going well. Then she put some potatoes in to bake. Baked potatoes were hot things. They would be good after that drive. The heat from the oven poured out to her, and it swept her again to the thought of the living huddled mass out there in the frigid darkness. The wind beat against the house. It was beating against them. She bit her lip hard, and again she said to herself, "No." She made some other preparations for supper. She had those things to do herself now. The Chinaman Ted had brought home with him in the fall had left in December. He had appeared before her ready for leaving, and had calmly said, "Cold here, missus, and 2 all alone. Me go where more others are." She had said nothing at all in reply to him, in protest, too held by what he had said. Cold here, and 2 all alone. She had stood at the window and watched him going up the road toward town, going where more others were. She went back now into their main room. It was both living and dining room these days, for since the extreme cold had fastened on them they had abandoned their 2 little upstairs bedrooms, and taken for sleeping the room which in summer was used as living room. That could be heated a little by leaving the door open, and it had seemed out of the question to go to bed in those upstairs rooms where the cold had been left untouched. Since they had been doing their own work, all extra things had had to be cut down. An upstairs fire would mean more work, and it seemed there was already more work than Ruth could get done and have time for anything else. She was tired all the time these days. She would think during the day of the good time she was going to have with a book that evening, and then night would find her so tired she could scarcely keep awake, and she would huddle there before the fire, dreading the cold of the night. Life had reduced itself to necessities. Things had to be ruthlessly rearranged for meeting conditions. She loved her own room to sleep in. She needed it. But she had given that up because it was too cold, because she could not do any more work. There was something that made her cringe in the thought of their sharing a bed, not because of love of being together, but because of the necessity of fighting the cold, and it made crowded quarters downstairs. She began picking up the room now. Things were piled up on the sewing machine, on the reading table. It seemed impossible to keep them put away. She tried hard to keep the room an attractive place to sit in, but it was in disorder, uninviting most of the time. Often, after doing the kitchen work, she would clean it all up with the idea of making it attractive to sit in, then would be too utterly tired to enjoy it. She lagged in putting things away now. She would stand holding them helplessly, not knowing where to put them. She got sick of it and just threw some of them into a closet, anything to get them out of sight for the time. She knew that was not the way to do, that it would make it harder another time. She felt like crying. It seemed things had got ahead of her, that she was swamped by them, and somehow she did not have the spirit or the strength to get a new start, make a new plan. Finally she had the room looking a little less slovenly, not so sordid, and was about to sit down with her magazine. But the lamp was flickering, and then she remembered that she had not filled it that day. She picked the lamp up, and slowly, drooping, started for the kitchen. She gave the can an angry little tilt, and the oil overflowed on the table. She was biting her lips as she went about looking for a cloth to wipe it up. She heard sleigh bells and knew Stuart was coming. Hastily she washed the oil from her hands, she always hated herself when her hands smelled of kerosene, and began getting things ready for supper. Stuart came hurrying and stamping in after putting the horse away, quickly banging the door shut and standing there pounding his feet and rubbing his stiffened hands. "Fearfully cold?" she inquired, hurriedly getting out the box of codfish she was going to cream for their supper. "Cold?" he scoffed, as if in scorn for the inadequacy of the word. After a minute he came up to the stove. "I was afraid," he said, holding his right hand in his left, "that it had got these fingers." He took off his big bearskin coat. A package he had taken from the pocket of it he threw over on the kitchen table. "Don't throw the bacon there, Stuart," hurriedly advised Ruth, busy with the cream sauce she was making. "I've just spilled oil there." "Heavens," he said irritably, shoving the bacon farther back. His tone made Ruth's hand tremble. "If you think I'm so careless you might fill the lamps yourself," she said tremulously. "Who said you were careless?" he muttered. He went in the other room and after a minute called out, as one trying to be pleasant, "What we going to have for supper?" "Creamed codfish," she told him. "For a little change," he said under his breath. "I don't think that's very kind, Stuart," she called back quiveringly. "It's not so simple a matter to have changes here now." "Oh, I know it," he said wearily. She brought the things in and they began the meal in silence. She had not taken time to lay the table properly. Things were not so placed as to make them attractive. Stuart tasted a piece of bread and then hastily put it aside, not concealing a grimace of distaste. "What's the matter?" Ruth asked sharply. "I don't seem to care much for bread and oil," he said in a voice it was plainly an effort to make light. Ruth's eyes filled. She picked up the plate of bread and took it to the kitchen. Stuart rose and went after her. "I'll get some more bread, Ruth," he said kindly. "Guess you're tired tonight, aren't you?" She turned away from him and took a drink of water. Then she made a big effort for control and went to the dining room. She asked some questions about town, and they talked in a perfunctory way until supper was over. He had brought papers and a couple of letters from town. Ruth was out in the kitchen doing the dishes when she heard a queer exclamation from him. "What is it, Stuart?" it made her ask quickly, going to the dining-room door with the cup she was wiping. He gave her a strange look, and then suddenly he laughed. "What is it?" The laugh made her repeat in quick, sharp voice. "Well, you'll never guess," he said. She frowned and stood there waiting. "Marian's going to get a divorce." He looked at her as if he did not believe what he said. Ruth put her hand out to the casement of the door. "She is?" she said dully. He held up a legal-looking paper. "Official notice," he said. Then suddenly he threw the thing over on the table, and with a short, hard laugh pulled his chair around to the fire. Ruth stood a moment looking at it lying there. Then she turned and went back to the dishes. When she returned to the living room the paper still lay there on the table. She had some darning to do, and she got out her things and sat down, chair turned to one side, not facing the legal-looking document. After a little while, Stuart, who had been figuring in a memorandum book, yawned and said he guessed he'd go to bed. He shook down the fire, then got up and picked up the paper from the table, folded it, and took it over to the big desk in the corner where his business things were. "Well, Ruth," he remarked, "this would have meant a good deal to us 10 or 12 years ago, wouldn't it?" She nodded, her head bent over the sock she was darning. "Oh well," he said, after a pause, "maybe it will help some even yet." She made no answer. "I suppose Marian wants to get married," he went on meditatively, after a moment adding bitterly, "Her wanting it is the only thing that would ever make her do it." He went down cellar for coal, and after he had filled the stove began undressing before it. When ready for bed he sat there a little before the fire, as if taking in all the heat he could for the night. Ruth had finished her darning and was putting the things away. "Coming to bed?" he asked of her. "Not right away," she said, her voice restrained. "Better not try to sit up late, Ruth," he said kindly. "You need plenty of sleep. I notice you're often pretty tired at night." She did not reply, putting things in the machine drawer. Her back was to him. "Well, Ruth?" he said, in a voice genial but slightly ironic. We can get married now." She went on doing things and still did not speak. "Better late than never," he said pleasantly, yawning. He stood up, ready for going into the bedroom, but still hating to leave the fire, standing there with his back to it. "When shall we get married, Ruth?" he went on, in a slightly amused voice. "Oh, I don't know, Stuart," she replied shortly from the kitchen. "Have to plan it out," he said sleepily, yawning once more. Then he laughed, as if the idea more and more amused him. After that he murmured, in the voice of one mildly curious about a thing, "I wonder if Marian is going to get married." Ruth wanted to take a bath before she went to bed. Taking a bath was no easy matter under their circumstances. It was so much work, and usually she was so tired that she would sometimes let it go longer than she would have supposed she would ever let bathing go. She was determined not to let it go tonight. She had the water on heating. She went down for the tub, went upstairs into her frigid room for the fresh things to put on in the morning. The room was so cold that there was a sort of horror about it. She went over to the window. The snow made the valley bright. Dimly she could see a massed thing, the huddled sheep. With a hard little laugh for the sob that shook her, she hurried out of the room. She took her bath before the fire in the living room. Stuart had piled on one chair the clothes that he had taken off and would put on in the morning. She placed on another the things for herself. And suddenly she looked at those two chairs, and the thing that she had been trying not to think about, that now they two could be married, seemed to sear her whole soul with mockery. She was rubbing some lotion on her red, chapped hands defaced by work and cold. She had a picture of her hands as they used to be, back there in those years when to have been free to marry Stuart would have made life radiant. She sat a long time before the fire, not wanting to go to bed. She particularly wanted to go to bed alone that night. There seemed something shameful in that night, sharing a bed as a matter of expediency. Stuart was snoring a little. She sat there, her face buried in her hands. The wind was beating against the house. It was beating against the sheep out there, too. It had a clean sweep against that outer rim of living things. She cried for a little while, and then, so utterly tired that it did not matter much, she went into the other room and crept into bed. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. But at last the cold had let go of them. It was April, the snow had gone, and the air promised that to even that valley spring would come. Ruth, out feeding the chickens, felt that spring nearness. She raised her face gratefully to the breeze. It had seemed almost unbelievable that the wind would ever again bring anything but blighting cold. As she stood there, held by that first feel of spring, an automobile came along, slowed, and Stuart went running out of the house to meet it. It was his friend Stoddard, a real estate man there. He had become friends with this man in the last few months. He had had little in friendships with men, and this had brightened him amazingly. He had a new interest in business things, new hopes. It had seemed to make him younger, keener. He and Mr. Stoddard had a plan for going into Montana, where the latter was interested in a land developing company, and going into business together. Stuart was alive with interest in it. It promised new things for him, a new chance. They would live in a town, and it would be business life, which he cared for as he had never come to care for ranching. He was beginning to talk to Ruth about moving, of selling off their stock and some of their things. He was eager to make the change. She had gone in the house as the machine stopped, having seen that there were people in the car with Mr. Stoddard, and not feeling presentably dressed. She went upstairs to do the work, and as she glanced down from the upper window, she saw Stuart in laughing conversation with a girl in the automobile. Something about it arrested her. He was standing to the far side of the machine so she could see his face. There was something in it she had not seen for a long time, that interest in women, an unmistakable pleasure in talking with an attractive girl. She stood there, a little back from the window, watching them. There was nothing at all wrong about it, nothing to resent, simply a little gay bantering with a girl. It was natural to him. It had been once. It could be again. His laugh came up to her. So he could still laugh like that. She had not heard him for a long time. He turned and started hurriedly for the house, the car waiting for him. He was smiling. His step was buoyant. "Ruth," he called up to her, and his voice, too, had the old buoyancy. "I'm going into town with Stoddard. We want to go over some things. He'll bring me back before night." "All right, Stuart," she called back pleasantly. She watched the car out of sight. Stuart, sitting in the front seat with his friend, had turned and was gaily talking with the women behind. When she first knew him, when she was still a little girl and used to see him around with his own set, he had been like that. She did not want to stay in the house. That house had shut her in all winter. The road stretched invitingly away. About a mile down it there was a creek. Willows grew there. Perhaps there she would find some real spring. Anyway, she had an impulse to get out to the moving water. She had seemed locked in. Everything had seemed locked in for so long. As she was getting her coat, she put into the pocket a letter she had received the day before from Dean Franklin. After she had sat a little while by the running water, she took the letter out to reread, but did not at first open it. She was wishing Dean was sitting there with her. She would like to talk to him. The letter was a gloomy one. It seemed that Dean, too, was locked in. Soon after Ted came back from Freeport in the fall, she had got it out of him about the Franklins. She had sensed at once that there was something about Dean he did not want to tell her, and before he left for his own place, she had it from him that the Franklins had indeed separated, and that the gossip of Freeport was that it was because of Mrs. Franklin's resentment of her. And that was one of the things had seemed to make it possible for the winter somehow to take her. That was the thing had seemed to close the last door to her spirit, the last of those doors that had been thrown wide open when she left Annie's home in Freeport the spring before. She had tried to write to Dean. She felt that she should write to him, but she had a feeling of powerlessness. Finally, only a little while before, she had brought herself to do it. She knew it was a poor letter, a halting, constrained thing, but it seemed the best she could do, and so finally, after a great deal of uncertainty, she sent it. His reply made her feel that he realized how it had been, why she had been so long in writing, why the letter had been the stilted thing it was. It gave her a feeling that her friend had not withdrawn from her because of what she had brought down upon him, that open channel between him and her was there as it had ever been. And though his letter did not make her happy, it loosened something in her, to be able to feel that the way between her and Dean was not closed. "Don't distress yourself, Ruth," she now reread, "or have it upon your spirit, where too much has lain heavy all these years. You want to know the truth, and the truth is that Amy did resent my feeling about you and your situation, and that put us apart. But you see it was not in us to stay together, or we could not have been thus put apart. Love can't do it all, Ruth, not for long. I mean love that hasn't roots down in the spirit can't. And where there isn't that spiritual underneath, without a hinterland, love is pretty insecure. I could have held on to it a while longer, I suppose, by cutting clear loose from the thing really me, and I suppose I would have done it if I could. I did, in fact, make attempts at it. But that meanness, I'm afraid, is most infernal strong in my miserable make-up, and somehow the withdrawal of oneself seems a lot to pay for even the happiness of love. There are some of us can't seem able to do it. So it's not you, Ruth. It's that it was like that, and that it came out through the controversy about you. Cast from your mind any feeling adding the wrecking of my happiness to your list of crimes. But, Ruth, I'm not happy. I couldn't get along in happiness, and I don't get along without it. It's a paralyzing thing not to have happiness, or to lose it, rather. Does it ever seem to you that life is a pretty paralyzing thing? That little by little, a little here and a little there, it gets us? We get harness broke, you see. Seems to have gone that way with most of the people I know. Seems to be that way with me. Don't let it do it to you. Somehow I don't believe it will. I think that you, Ruth, would be a fine little prison breaker. Might stand some show of being one myself if I were anywhere but in this town. There's something about it that has got me, Ruth. If it hadn't, I'd be getting out of it now. But of course I'm a pretty poor sort, not worth making a fight for, or it wouldn't be like this. And for that matter, what's the difference? Lives aren't counting for much these days. Men who are the right sort going down by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. So what, for heaven's sake, does it matter about me? I wish I could see you. I'm glad for you about the divorce. I believe the case comes up this April term, so it may be all over by the time you get this letter. Pretty late in coming, and I suppose it must seem a good deal of a mockery, getting it now. But maybe it will help some for the future, make you feel more comfortable, and I'm awfully glad. Funny about it, isn't it? I wonder what made her do it. I was called there this winter, maid sick, miscarriage, and Mrs. Williams puzzled me. Didn't turn the girl out, awfully decent to her. I would have supposed she would have been quite the other way. And now this. Queer, don't you think? Write to me sometimes, Ruth. Sometimes write to me what you're thinking about. Maybe it will stir me up. Write to me to take a brace and get out of this town. If you went for me hard enough, called me all the insulting names you could think of, and told me a living dead man was the most cowardly and most disgusting object cluttering up the earth, you might get a rise out of me. You're the one could do it if it can be done. One thing I do know. Writing this has made me want like blazes to see you. Dean. Ruth sat there in the arm of a low willow, her hands resting upon Dean's letter, her eyes closed, the faint breath of coming spring upon her face. She was tired and very sad. She was thinking of Dean's life, of her own life, of the way one seemed mocked. She wished that Dean were there. She could talk to him, and she would like to talk. His letter moved something in her. Something that had long seemed locked in stirred a little. Her feeling about life had seemed a thing frozen within her. Now the feeling that there was still this open channel between her and Dean was as a thawing, an outlet. She thought of her last talk with Dean, of their walk together that day, almost a year before, when he came to see her at Annie's, the very day she was starting back west. She had felt anything but locked in that day. There was that triumphant sense of openness to life, the joy of new interest in it, of zest for it. And then she came back west, to Stuart, and somehow the radiance went, courage ebbed. It came to seem that life was all fixed, almost as if life, in the real sense, was over. That sense of having failed, having been inadequate to her own feeling, struck her down to a wretched powerlessness. And so routine, hard work, bitter cold, loneliness, that sense of the cruelty of life which the sternness of the country gave, those things had been able to take her. It was because something had gone dead in her. She thought of that spiritual hinterland Dean talked about. She thought of her and Stuart. She grew very sad in the thinking. She wondered if it was her fault. However it was true they no longer found the live things in one another. She had not been able to communicate to him the feeling with which she came back from Annie's. It was a lesser thing for trying to talk of it to him. She did not reach him. She knew that he only thought her a little absurd. After that she did not try to talk to him of what she felt. Life lessened. Things were as they were. They too were as they were. It came to seem just a matter of following out what had begun. And then that news of the divorce had come to mock her. But she must do something for Dean. Dean must not go like that. She had brought pencil and writing tablet with her, thinking that perhaps out of doors, away from the house where she had seemed locked in all winter, she could write to him. She thought of things to say, things that should be said, but she did not seem to have any power to charge them with life. How could the dead rouse the dead? She sat there thinking of her and Dean, of how they had always been able to reach one another. And finally she began. Dear Dean, you must find your way back to life. She did not go on. She sat staring at what she had written. She read it over. She said it aloud. It surged in upon her, into shut places. She sat looking at it, frightened at what it was doing. Sat looking at it after it was all blurred by tears, looking down at the words she herself had written. You must find your way back to life. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth was very quiet through the next week. Stuart was preoccupied with the plans he was making for going to Montana. When he talked with her it was of that, of arrangements to be made for it, and his own absorption apparently kept him from taking note of her being more quiet than usual, or different. It was all working out very well. He had found a renter for the ranch, The prospects for the venture in Montana were good. They were to move within a month. And one night in late April, when he came home from town, he handed Ruth a long envelope with a laughing, "Better late than never." Then he was soon deep in some papers. Ruth was sorting a box of things. There were many things to be gone through preparatory to moving. She had put the paper announcing his divorce aside without comment, but she loitered over what she was doing. She was watching Stuart, thinking about him. She was thinking with satisfaction that he looked well. He had thrown off the trouble that had brought about their departure from Freeport 12 years before. He was growing rather stout. His fair hair had gone somewhat gray, and his face was lined. He had not the look of a young man. But he looked strong, alert. His new hopes had given him vigor, a new buoyancy. She sat there thinking of the years she had lived with him, of the wonder and the happiness she had known through him, of the hard things they had faced together. Her voice was gentle as she replied to his inquiry about what day of the month it was. "I think," he said, "that we can get off by the 15th, don't you, Ruth?" "Perhaps." Her voice shook a little, but he was following his own thoughts and did not notice. After a little he came and sat across the table from her. "And, Ruth, about this getting married business," he broke off with a laugh. "Seems absurd, doesn't it?" She nodded, fumbling with the things in the box, her head bent over them. "Well, I was thinking we'd better stop somewhere along the way and attend to it. Can't do it here, don't want to there." She lifted her hands from the box and laid them on the table that was between him and her. She looked over at him and said, quietly, in a voice that shook only a little, "I do not want to get married, Stuart." He was filling his pipe and stopped abruptly, spilling the tobacco on the table. "What did you say?" he asked in the voice of one sure he must have heard wrong. "I said," she repeated, "that I did not want to get married." He stared at her, his face screwed up. Then it relaxed a little. "Oh, yes. Yes, I know how you feel. It seems so absurd, after all this time, after all there has been. But we must attend to it, Ruth. It's right that we should, now that we can. God knows we wanted to bad enough, long ago. And it will make us feel better about going into a new place. We can face people better." He gathered up the tobacco he had spilled and put it in his pipe. For a moment she did not speak. Then, "That wasn't what I meant, Stuart," she said falteringly. "Well, then, what in the world do you mean?" he asked impatiently. She did not at once say what she meant. Her eyes held him, they were so strangely steady. "Just why would we be getting married, Stuart?" she asked simply. At first he could only stare at her, appeared to be waiting for her to throw light on what she had asked. When she did not do that, he moved impatiently, as if resentful of being quizzed this way. Why, because we can now. Because it's the thing to do. Because it will be expected of us," he concluded, with gathering impatience for this unnecessary explanation. A faint smile traced itself about Ruth's mouth. It made her face very sad as she said, "I do not seem to be anxious to marry for any of those reasons, Stuart." "Ruth, what are you driving at?" he demanded, thoroughly vexed at the way she had bewildered him. "This is what I am driving at, Stuart," she began, a little more spiritedly. But then she stopped, as if dumb before it. She looked over at him as if hoping her eyes would tell it for her. But as he continued in that look of waiting, impatient bewilderment, she sighed and turned a little away. "Don't you think, Stuart," she asked, her voice low, "that the future is rather too important a thing to be given up to ratifying the past?" He pushed his chair back in impatience that was mounting to anger. "Just what do you mean?" he asked, stiffly. She picked up the long envelope lying on the table between them. She held it in her hand a moment without speaking. For as she touched it, she had a sense of what it would have meant to have held it in her hand 12 years before, over on the other side of their life together, a new sense of the irony and the pity of not having had it then, and having it now. She laid it down between them. "To me," she said, "this sets me free." "Free to choose," she went on, as he only stared at her. There was a moment of looking at him out of eyes so full of feeling that they held back the feeling that had flushed his face. "And my choice," she said, with a strange steadiness, is that I now go my way alone." He spoke then, but it was only to stammer. "Why, Ruth!" Helplessly he repeated, "Ruth!" "But you see, you do see," she cried, "if it had not been so much, so beautiful, just because it was what it was—" She choked and could not go on. He came around and sat down beside her. The seriousness of his face, something she had touched in him, made it finer than it had been in those last years of routine. It was more as it used to be. His voice, too, seemed out of old days as he said, "Ruth, I don't know yet what you mean, why you're saying this." "I think you do, Stuart," she said simply. "Or I think you will if you'll let yourself. It's simply that this," she touched the envelope on the table before her, "that this finds us over on the other side of marriage. And this is what I mean," she flamed. "I mean that the marriage between us was too real to go through the mockery this would make possible now." She turned away because she was close to tears. He sat there in silence. Then, "Have I done anything, Ruth?" he asked, in the hesitating way of one at sea. She shook her head without turning back to him. "You apparently have got the impression," he went on, a faint touch of resentment creeping into his voice at having to make the declaration, "that I don't care any more. That isn't so," he said awkwardly and with a little rise of resentment. Ruth had turned a little more toward him, but was looking down at her hands, working with them as if struggling for better control. "I have no complaint on that score," she said very low. "Things change," he went on, with a more open manner of defense. "The first kind of love doesn't last forever. It doesn't with anyone," he finished rather sullenly. "I know that, Stuart," she said quietly. "I know enough to know that. But I know this as well. I know that sometimes that first kind of love leaves a living thing to live by. I know that it does, sometimes. And I know that with us, it hasn't." As if stung by that, he got up and began walking angrily about the room. "You're talking nonsense. Why wouldn't we get married, I'd like to know, after all this time together? We will get married. That's all there is to it. A nice spectacle we would make of ourselves if we didn't. Have you thought of that?" he demanded. "Have you thought of what people would say?" Again her lips traced that faint smile that showed the sadness of her face. "There was a time, Stuart," she said wearily, "when we were not governed by what people would say." He frowned, but went on more mildly. "You've got the thing all twisted up, Ruth. You do that sometimes. You often have a queer way of looking at a thing. Not the usual way. A sort of twisted way." She got up. One hand was at her throat as if feeling some impediment there. The knuckles of her clenched hand were tapping the table. "A queer way of looking at things," she said, in quick, sharp voice that was like the tapping of her knuckles. "Not the usual way. A sort of twisted way. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps that was the way I had of looking at things 12 years ago, when I left them all behind and went with you. Perhaps that was what made me do it, that queer, twisted way of looking at things. But this much is true, Stuart, and this you have got to know is true. I went with you because I was as I was. I'm going my way alone now because I am as I am. And what you don't see is this, that the thing that made me go with you then is the thing that makes me go my way alone now." For a moment they stood there facing each other, her eyes forcing home what she had said. But she was trembling, and suddenly, weakly, she sat down. "Well, I simply can't understand it," he cried petulantly, and flung open the door and stood looking out. "Look here, Ruth," he turned sharply to her after a little. "Have you thought of the position this puts me in? Have you thought of the position you would put me in?" he contended hotly. "Do you know what people would say about me? You ought to know what they'd say. They'd say I was the one. They'd say I didn't want to do it." There was a little catch, something like a laugh, as she replied, "Of course. They'll say men don't marry women of that sort, won't they?" "Oh, you can't do this, Ruth," he went on quickly. "You see, it can't be done. I tell you it wouldn't be right. It just wouldn't be right, in any sense. Why can't you see that? Can't you see that we've got to vindicate the whole thing? That we've got to show them that it does last? That's the vindication for it. he finished stoutly, "that it's the kind of a love that doesn't die. And I'd like to know where under the sun you'd go," he demanded hotly, irritated at the slight smile his last words had brought. "What I will do, Stuart, after leaving you is for me to determine, isn't it?" "A nice way to treat me!" he cried, and threw himself down on the couch, elbows on his knees and his face buried in his hands. "After all these years, after all there has been, that's a nice way," he choked. She was quick to go over and sit beside him. She leaned a little against him, her hand on his arm, just as she had sat many times when he needed her, when she brought him comfort. The thought of all those times rose in her, and brought tears to her eyes that had been burning dry a moment before. She felt the feeling this had whipped to life in him and was moved by it, and by an underlying feeling of the sadness of change. For his expostulations spoke of just that, change. She knew this for the last hurt she could help him through, that she must help him through this hurt brought him by this last thing she could do for him. Something about things being like that moved her deeply. She saw it all so clearly and so sadly. It was not grief this brought him. This was not the frenzy or the anguish in the thought of losing her that there would have been in those other years. It was shock, rather, disturbance, and the forcing home to him that sense of change. He would have gone on without much taking stock, because, as he had said, it was the thing to do. Habit, a sense of fitness rather than deep personal need, would have made him go on. And now it was his sense that it was gone, his resentment against that, his momentary feeling of being left desolate. She looked at his bowed head through tears. Gently she laid her hand on it. She thought of him as he stood before the automobile the other day, lighting up in the gay talk with that girl. She knew, with a sudden wrench in her heart she knew it, that he would not be long desolate. She understood him too well for that. She knew that, hard as she seemed in that hour, she was doing for Stuart in leaving him the greatest thing she could now do for him. A tear fell to her hand in her clear knowing of that. There was deep sadness in knowing that, after all there had been, to leave the way cleared of herself was doing a greater thing than anything else she could do for him. A sob shook her, and he raised his face, upon which there were tears, and clutched her two wrists with his hands. "Ruth," he whispered, "it will come back. I feel that this has brought it back." The look of old feeling had transformed his face. After barren days it was sweet to her. It tempted her to shut her eyes to what she knew and sink into the sweetness of believing herself loving and loved again. Perhaps for a little time they could do it. To be deeply swayed by this common feeling, to go together in an emotion, was like dear days gone. But it was her very fidelity to those days gone that made her draw just a little away, and, tears running down her face, shake her head. She knew too well, and she had the courage of her knowing. This was something that had seeped up from old feeling. It had no life of its own. What they were sharing now was grief over a dead thing that had been theirs together. That grief, that sharing, left them tender. This was their moment for leaving it. They must leave it before it lay there between them both, dead and unmourned, clogging life for them. She whispered to him, "Just because of all it has meant, let's leave it while we can leave it like this." End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The man who worked for them had gone ahead in the spring wagon with her trunk. She was waiting for Ted to hitch the other horse to the buggy and drive her into the train. She was all ready, and stood there looking about the house she was leaving. There were things in that room which they had had since their first years together. That couch, this chair, had come to them in Arizona, in the days when they loved each other with a passion that made everything else in the world a pale thing before their love. She stood picking out things that they had had when love was flaming strong in them, and it seemed they two fought together against the whole world. And as she stood there alone, in their place in common that she was about to leave, she was made sick by a sense of failure, that desolate sense of failure she had tried all along to beat down. That love had been theirs. And this was what it had come to. That wonder had been, and it ended in the misery of this leave-taking. She turned sharply around, opened the door, and stood there in the doorway, her back to the place she was quitting, her pale, stern face turned to the mountains, to that eastern range which she was going to cross. She tried to draw something from them, draw strength for the final conflict which she knew she would have with Ted while they drove into town. She looked toward the barnyard to see if he was most ready, and could not but smile a little at his grim, resolute face as he was checking up the horse. She could see so well that he was going to make the best of his time while driving her in to the train. And it seemed she had nothing left in her for combat. She would be glad to see the train that was to take her away. 3 days before, Stuart had gone suddenly to Denver. He went with his friend Stoddard, regarding some of their arrangements for Montana. He had found only at the last minute that he would have to go, had hurriedly driven out from town to get his things and tell her he was going. He had been in the house only a few minutes and was all excitement about the unexpected trip. It was 2 days after their talk. After their moment of being swept together by the feeling of things gone, he had, as if having to get a footing on everyday ground, ended the talk with saying, "I'll tell you, Ruth, you need a little change. We'll have to work it out." The next day they were both subdued, more gentle with each other than they had been of late, but they did not refer to the night before. After he had hurriedly kissed her good-bye when leaving for Denver, he had turned back and said, "And don't you worry about things, Ruth. We'll get everything fixed up, and a little change." He had hurried down to the machine without finishing it. She had gone to the window and watched him disappear. He was sitting erect, alert, talking animatedly with his friend. She watched him as far as she could see him. She knew that she would not see him again. And then she hitched up the horse and drove into town and telephoned Ted, who lived about 50 miles to the north. She told him that she was going east, and asked him to come down the next day and see her. She had known that Ted would not approve, would not understand, but she had not expected him to make the fight he had. It had taken every bit of her will, her force, to meet him. Worn now, and under the stress of the taking leave, at once too tired and too emotional, she wished that he would let it rest. But the grim line of his jaw told her that he had no such intention. She felt almost faint as they drove through the gate. She closed her eyes and did not open them for some time. "You see, Ruth," Ted began gently, as if realizing that she was very worn, "you just don't realize how crazy the whole thing is. It's ridiculous for you to go to New York, alone. You've never been there," he said firmly. "No, that is one reason for going," she answered rather feebly. "One reason for going!" he cried. "What'll you do when the train pulls in? Where'll you go?" "I don't know, Ted," she said patiently, "just where I will go. And I rather like that, not knowing where I will go. It's all new, you see. Nothing is mapped out." "It's a fool thing," he cried. "Don't you know that something will happen to you?" She smiled a little, very wearily. "Lots of things have happened to me, Ted, and I've come through them somehow." After a moment she added, with more spirit, "There's just one thing might happen to me that I haven't the courage to face." He looked at her inquiringly. "Nothing happening," she said, with a little smile. He turned impatiently and slapped the horse with the reins. "You seem to have lost your senses," he said sharply. He drove along in silence for a little. Ruth looked at him and his face seemed hard. She thought of how close she and Ted had come, how good he had been, how much it had meant. She could not leave him like this. She must make the effort, must gather herself together and try and make Ted see. "Perhaps, Ted," she began tremulously, "you think I have taken leave of my senses because you haven't tried very hard to understand just what it is I feel." She smiled wanly as she added, "You've been so absorbed in your own disapproval, you know." "Well, how can I be any other way?" he demanded. "Going away like this, for no reason, on a wild goose chase. Isn't Stuart good to you?" he asked abruptly. "Yes, Ted," she answered, as if she were tired of saying it. "Stuart is good enough to me." "I suppose things aren't just as they used to be," he went on a little doggedly. "Heavens, they aren't with anybody. And what will people say?" he broke out with new force. "Think of what people in Freeport will say, Ruth. They'll say the whole thing was a failure and that it was because you did wrong. They'll say, when the chance finally came, that Stuart didn't want to marry you." He colored but brought it out bluntly. "I suppose they will," agreed Ruth. "And if they knew the truth, or what I know, though heaven knows I'm balled up enough about what the truth really is, they'd say it just shows again that you are different, not something wrong," he finished bitterly. She said nothing for a moment. "And is that what you think, Ted?" she asked, choking a little. "I don't understand it, Ruth," he said less aggressively. "I had thought you would be so glad of the chance to marry. He hesitated but did not pursue that. He had never told her of going to see Mrs. Williams, of the effort he had made for her. It seemed that now, when your chance came, you ought to show people that you do want to do the right thing. It surprises me a lot, Ruth, that you don't feel that way, and oh, I don't get it at all," he concluded abruptly. Tears were very close when, after a little, she answered, "Well, Ted, maybe when you have less of life left you will understand better what it is I feel. Perhaps," she went on in answer to his look inquiry, "when the future has shrunk down to fewer years you'll see it as more important to get from it what you can." They drove for a little time in silence. They had come in sight of the town, and she had not won Ted. She was going away without his sympathy. And she was going away alone, more alone this time than she had been 12 years before. She laid her hand on his arm, left it there while she was speaking. "Ted," she said, "it's like this. This has gone for me. It's all gone. It was wonderful, but it's gone. Some people, I know, could go on with the life love had made after love was gone. I am not one of those people, that's all. You speak of there being something discreditable in my going away just when I could marry. To me there would be something discreditable in going on. It would be—" She put her hand over her heart and said it very simply. "It would be unfaithful to something here." She choked a little and he turned away. "But I don't see how you can bear, Ruth," he said after a moment, made gentle by her confidence, "to feel that it has failed. I don't see how you can bear, after all you paid for it, to let it come to nothing." "Don't say that, Ted!" she cried in a voice that told he had touched the sorest place. "Don't say that!" she repeated a little wildly. "You don't know what you're talking about. Failed! A thing that glorified life for years. Failed?" Her voice broke, but it was more steadily she went on. "That's the very reason I'm going to New York. Simply that it may not come to nothing. I'm going away from it for that very reason, that it may not come to nothing, that my life may not come to nothing. What I've had, what I've gone through, lives in me, Ted. It doesn't come to nothing if I come to something." She stopped abruptly with a choking little laugh. Ted looked at her wonderingly, but the hardness had gone out of his look. "But what are you going to do, Ruth?" he asked gently. "I don't know yet. I've got to find out." "You must see that I can't help but worry about it," he went on. "Going so far away, to a place absolutely unknown to you, where I'm afraid it will be so much harder than you think." She did not answer him, looking off to that eastern range she was going to cross, as if the mountains could help her to hold on to her own feeling against the doubts he was trying to throw around her. "You see, Ruth," he went on, as if feeling his way, not wanting to hurt her, "what has been may make it hard to go on. You can't tell. You'll never know, never be sure. Old things may come up to spoil new ones for you. That's what I'm so afraid of. That's what it seems you aren't seeing. You would be so much safer to stay with Stuart." She turned to him with a little laugh, her lashes wet. "Yes, Ted dear, I suppose I would. But I never did seem to stay where I was safest, did I?" "Don't worry about me, Ted," she said, just as they were coming into town. "I'm going to take some of Father's money. Yes, I know it isn't a great deal, but enough for a little while till I get my bearings. And I'm going to make things come alive for me again. I'm not through yet, that's all. I could have stayed with life gone dead. It would have been safer, as you say. But you see, I'm not through yet, Ted. I guess that's the secret of it all. I want more life, more things from life. And I'm going to New York just because it will be so completely new, so completely beginning new, and because it's the center of so many living things. And it's such a wonderful time, Ted. It seems to me the war is going to make a new world, a whole new way of looking at things. It's as if a lot of old things, old ideas had been melted, and were fluid now and were to be shaped anew. That's the way it seems to me, and that makes me the more eager to get some things from life that I haven't had. I've been shut in with my own experience. If I stayed on here, I'd be shut in with my own dead experiences. I want to go on. I can't stop here, that's all. And we have to find our way for going on. We must find our own way, Ted, even, she choked, though what we see as the way may seem a wild goose chase to someone we love. I'll tell you why I'm going to New York, she flashed with sudden defiance. I'm going because I want to. She laughed a little, and he laughed with her. Then she went on more gently. Because I want to. Just the thought of it has made life come alive for me. That's reason enough for going to the ends of the earth. I'm going to live again, Ted, not just go on with what living has left. I'm going to find some work to do. Yes, I can, she cried passionately in response to his gesture. I suppose to you it seems just looking out for myself, seems unfaithful to Stuart. Well, it isn't. That's all I can say, and maybe someday you'll see that it wasn't. It isn't unfaithful to turn from a person you have nothing more to offer, for whom you can no longer make life a living thing. It's more faithful to go. You'll see that sometime, Ted. But be good to Stuart, she hastily added. You stay with him till he can get off. I've made all the arrangements with Mrs. Baxter for packing up, sending on the things. It would be hard for him to do that, I know. And once away from here, new interests, life all new again. Oh no, Ted dear, she laughed a little chokingly. Don't worry about Stuart. I'm not worrying about Stuart, he muttered. I'm worrying about you. She squeezed his arm in affectionate gratitude for the love in the growling words. Don't worry about me, Ted, she implored. Be glad with me. I'm alive again. It's so wonderful to be alive again. There's the future, a great, beautiful unknown. It is wonderful, Ted, she said with insistence, as if she would banish his fears and her own. They had a few minutes to wait, and Ted ran over to the post office to get her mail for her. She was expecting a paper she wanted to read on the train. She tucked what he handed her into her bag, and then, when she heard the train coming, she held on to Ted's arm, held it as if she could not bear letting it go. It's all right, were her last words to him, smiling through tears. She had been trying all along to hold her mind from the thought that they would pass through Freeport. Late the next afternoon, when she knew they were nearing it, she grew restless. It was then she remembered the paper in her bag. She had been in no mood for reading, too charged with her own feeling. She got it out now, and found that with the paper was a letter. It was a letter from Dean Franklin. She held it for a little while without opening it. It seemed so strange to have it just as she was nearing Freeport. The letter was dated the week before. It read, Dear Ruth, I'm leaving Freeport tonight. I'm going to Europe, to volunteer my services as a doctor. Parker, whom I knew well at Hopkins, is right in the midst of it. He can work me in. And the need for doctors is going to go on for some time, I fancy. It won't end with the war. I'm happy in this decision, Ruth, and I know you'll be glad for me. It was your letter that got me, made me see myself and hate myself, made me know that I had to come out of it. And then this idea came to me, and I wish I could tell you how different everything seemed as soon as I saw some reason for my existence. I'm ashamed of myself for not having seen it this way before. As if this were any time for a man who's had my training to sit around moping. Life is bigger than just ourselves. And isn't it curious how seeing that brings us back to ourselves? I'll enclose Parker's address. You can reach me in care of him. I want to hear from you. I can hardly wait to get there. Dean. She managed to read the letter through with eyes only a little dimmed. But by the time she got to Parker's address, she could not make it out. I knew it, she kept saying to herself triumphantly. Dean had been too big not to save himself. Absorbed in thoughts of him, she did not notice the country through which they were passing. She was startled by a jolt of the train, by the conductor saying, Freeport! For several minutes the train waited there. She sat motionless through that time, Dean Franklin's letter clasped tight in her hand. Freeport. It claimed her. What had been, what was behind her, those dead who lived in her, her own past that lived in her. Freeport. It laid strong hold on her. She was held there in what had been. And then a great thing happened. The train jolted again, moved. It was moving, moving on. She was moving, moving on. And she knew then beyond the power of anyone's disapproval to break down that it was right she move on. She had a feeling of the whole flow of her life, and it was still moving, moving on. And because she felt she was moving on, that sense of failure slipped from her. In secret she had been fighting that all along. Now she knew that love had not failed because love had transpired into life. What she had paid the great price for was not hers to the end. But what it had made of her was hers. Love could not fail if it left one richer than it had found one. Love had not failed. Nothing had failed. And life was wonderful, limitless, a great adventure for which one must have great courage, glad faith. Let come what would come. She was moving on. End of chapter 34. End of Fidelity by Susan Glaspell. Read for LibriVox.org by Arielle Lipshaw.